Aren't you tired of the emotionless, soulless, and monotonous AI voices you encounter at every turn? Today, I'm bringing you history's most impossible journey, the massive footsteps of Hannibal's elephants in the Alps and the freezing silence that reshaped the ancient world, narrated personally with my own voice and a soulful touch. If you're ready to take your place in this epic journey, don't forget to like the video to support me. And the part I'm most curious about, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it exactly? Let's meet in the comments. If you're ready, we're returning to history's deepest indigo night, to the place where it all began. In the fading light of the late autumn of 218 before the Common Era, the vast expanse of the Carthaginian army stood at the precipice of the unknown Hannibal Barca. The young and formidable commander of the Punic forces gazed upon the towering silhouettes of the Alps, which rose like jagged teeth against the darkening sky. This was a moment of profound historical weight, as no army of such magnitude had ever attempted to traverse these frozen heights with the intention of invading the Roman heartland. The composition of the host was as diverse as the lands Hannibal had conquered, comprising Libyan spearmen with their heavy bronze-faced shields, Iberian infantry accustomed to the rugged terrain of the peninsula, and the swift Numidian cavalry whose horses were now shivering in the unaccustomed chill of the mountain air. The most striking element of this gathered force was the presence of 37 African forest elephants, creatures born for the sun-drenched savannas, now facing the prospect of ice and vertical stone. Their massive forms moved like living mountains through the camp, their rhythmic breathing creating plumes of frost that hung in the air like ghostly whispers in the moonlight. Around the flickering embers of the few allowed fires, the soldiers sought what little warmth they could find, wrapping themselves in heavy wool cloaks and thick animal hides, while the silence of the high altitude began to settle over the valley. The logistical challenge of this undertaking was immense, requiring the transport of vast quantities of grain for the men and fodder for the thousands of animals, all while navigating narrow paths that were often no more than goat tracks carved into the cliffside. Hannibal moved among his troops with a quiet intensity, his presence alone serving as a stabilizing force for men who were thousands of miles from home. He did not speak words of encouragement, but his steady gaze toward the north signaled a commitment that transcended fear. The geological majesty of the Alps served as a silent witness to this human ambition, with glaciers and granite walls reflecting the pale light of a rising moon. The air grew thinner and colder with every passing hour, heralding the onset of a winter that would become the army's most formidable enemy. The sound of the wind whistling through the rocky crags was the only melody in this desolate landscape, occasionally punctuated by the low, resonant rumble of an elephant or the clatter of a horse's hoof against the freezing stone. As the mist began to roll down from the higher elevations, it draped the camp in a veil of silver and blue, blurring the lines between the physical world and the myths that the soldiers whispered about the spirits of the mountains. This was the threshold of a journey that would change the course of Mediterranean history, a march that defied the traditional boundaries of military strategy and human endurance. Every soldier understood that the path forward led only into the clouds, and that the descent on the other side would either lead to the gates of Rome or to a forgotten grave in the ice. The stillness of the night was heavy with the anticipation of the first climb, the beginning of a 15-day odyssey through the clouds. The flickering torches of the sentries appeared as tiny, isolated stars against the backdrop of the massive mountain range, emphasizing the fragility of the human endeavor against the indifference of nature. Hannibal's mind was a map of possibilities, calculating the angles of ascent and the locations of potential ambushes by the hostile Allobroges tribes who inhabited the lower slopes. The metallic scent of the coming snow hung heavy in the atmosphere, a precursor to the white blanket that would soon cover the precarious trails. Within the camp, the clinking of chainmail and the sharpening of iron blades provided a rhythmic undertone to the night, as the men prepared their equipment for the rigors of the vertical ascent. The heavy leather straps of the pack animals were tightened and checked for wear, while the blacksmiths worked in silence to ensure that the horses' hooves were protected against the jagged rocks. This first section of the journey was not merely a physical movement, but a psychological transition from the known world of the Mediterranean into the vertical wilderness of the north. The shadows of the elephants stretched long across the valley floor, cast by the low-hanging moon that seemed to rest upon the very peaks they were destined to climb. The silence of the commander was mirrored in the discipline of his officers, who oversaw the distribution of the final rations before the march began in earnest. The vastness of the mountains made the army appear small, yet the collective will of the soldiers created a force that seemed capable of moving the earth itself. As the night deepened, the blue hue of the landscape intensified, casting a serene and somber light over the thousands of sleeping forms who dreamed of the warmth they had left behind. The mountain paths grew increasingly precarious as the Carthaginian column wound its way higher into the rugged foothills of the Alps, where the ancient stones seemed to resist the intrusion of such a massive and foreign force. The terrain was a labyrinth of narrow ledges and crumbling shale, often barely wide enough for a single pack animal to pass without brushing against the unforgiving rock faces. In the deep blue of the alpine twilight, the soldiers moved with a hushed reverence, as if loud sounds might trigger the avalanches that lurked in the snow-dusted crags above. Hannibal, riding a sturdy mountain horse rather than his usual war steed, led from the front of the vanguard, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines for the shifting shadows of the Allobroge's tribesmen. These local warriors, who viewed the invaders as both a threat and a source of potential plunder, had occupied the narrowest passes, intending to harass the army from above with stones and javelins. Academic consensus suggests that these early encounters were a test of Hannibal's tactical adaptability in an environment that favored the defender. To counter the threat, the Carthaginian commander utilized his Gallic scouts to learn the rhythms of the mountain people, discovering that they would withdraw to their fortified villages in the valleys as the sun set, leaving the high ground unguarded during the freezing night hours. Seizing this opportunity, Hannibal handpicked a body of light-armed troops to ascend the heights under the cover of the blue-gray mist, moving with a silent efficiency that was the hallmark of his veteran units. The night was an ally for the bold, providing a screen of deep shadows and silver moonlight that masked their ascent from the eyes of the villagers below. For the men climbing those vertical walls, the air was a biting presence, a physical weight that pressed against their chests as they struggled for breath in the thinning atmosphere. Every grip on the cold granite was a gamble, and every footfall on the frozen moss was a test of balance, while the distant roar of mountain torrents provided a constant, low-frequency hum to the night. Below them, the main body of the army lay in a state of uneasy rest, the thousands of soldiers huddled together for warmth in the depressions of the terrain, their breathing synchronized in a rhythmic tide of white vapor. The elephants, the 37 titans of the Carthaginian war machine, stood in the center of the camp, their massive trunks curled close to their bodies to conserve heat, their eyes reflecting the pale stars that seemed to hang just above the peaks. These animals, native to the warmth of North Africa, were experiencing a biological shock. Yet they remained stoic under the guidance of their mahouts, who spoke to them in low, melodic tones to keep them calm in the face of the encroaching ice. The logistics of the climb were a marvel of ancient engineering and organization, with the heavy baggage train of thousands of mules and horses being managed with a discipline that prevented the narrow paths from becoming hopelessly choked. The scent of whetstone, ancient pine, and the metallic tang of bronze armor filled the air, creating a sensory landscape that was as sharp and cold as a blade. As the elite units reached the summit of the pass in the dead of night, They looked out over a world of blue-lit silence, where the glaciers of the higher Alps glowed with an internal, ghostly light. This was a realm where time seemed to have slowed to the pace of the shifting ice, and the human struggle for empire felt like a fleeting shadow against the permanence of the mountains. The silence of the peaks was not an absence of sound, but a presence in itself. A heavy, cold blanket that muffled the clink of swords and the rustle of wool cloaks. Hannibal's plan to seize the heights was not merely about tactical position, but about psychological dominance, proving to his men and his enemies alike that the mountains themselves could be mastered through intellect and willpower. The blue shadows of the night stretched long and thin across the valley floor, marking the passage of hours that felt like lifetimes to those suspended between the earth and the sky. As the first hints of a pale, cold dawn began to touch the highest peaks, the Carthaginian banners, the symbols of a desert empire, were set atop the first great barrier of the north, overlooking the winding, silver ribbon of the army below and the vast, dark expanse of the path that still lay ahead. The transition from the lowlands to the high ridges was complete, but the true trials of the ascent were only just beginning to manifest in the deepening frost. Each man felt the isolation of the heights, a distance from the world of cities and plains that grew with every vertical foot they conquered. The heavy thud of the elephant's footsteps, now muffled by a thin layer of night-fallen snow, served as a steady, heartbeat-like reminder of their progress through the silence, and as the stars began to fade into the dawn, the realization of their height became a shared, unspoken awe. The dawn brought not relief, but a new set of challenges as the main body of the army began its climb into the seized pass. The Allobroges tribesmen, seeing their positions taken in the night, did not retreat, but launched a desperate and chaotic assault on the winding column from the higher slopes. Rocks and javelins rained down upon the pack animals, causing panic among the horses and mules that were laden with the army's vital supplies. Many animals, startled by the sudden violence and the precariousness of the ledges, lost their footing and tumbled into the abyss. Their silent fall a chilling reminder of the fragility of life in these heights. Hannibal, observing the chaos from his vantage point, realized that the loss of the baggage train would mean the certain starvation of his troops, and he led a counter-attack to stabilize the line. Academic accounts detail the brutality of this mountain warfare, where the terrain was as much a combatant as the humans. The narrowness of the paths meant that every movement had to be calculated with surgical precision. Yet the press of thousands of men and animals made such precision nearly impossible. The elephants, usually a source of terror for enemies, were themselves terrified by the echoes of the combat and the instability of the ground, and their mahots struggled to keep the great beasts from crushing the very soldiers they were meant to protect. Despite the conflict, the overarching atmosphere remained one of cold, blue isolation. The smoke from small, scattered skirmish fires rose vertically in the still air, mingling with the pervasive mist that clung to the granite walls. The scent of blood was quickly masked by the overwhelming smell of wet earth, pine resin, and the biting ozone of the high altitude. As the day progressed and the tribesmen were eventually repelled, a heavy, exhausted silence returned to the pass. The cost of the passage was evident in the abandoned equipment and the broken bodies of animals that littered the trails, their faces etched with the fatigue of both battle and the ascent, moved like shadows through the deepening twilight. Each step was a labor, a victory over the thinning air and the growing weight of their own gear. The blue light of the evening began to reclaim the mountainside, casting long, distorted shadows of the column against the white snowfield. The stars appeared once more, sharp and indifferent to the human drama unfolding below, serving as the only guides for a people lost in a vertical world. The logistical genius of the Carthaginian command was tested to its limit. As officers worked through the night to reorganize the column and ensure that the most essential supplies were prioritized, the rhythmic clinking of iron and the low murmurs of the men were the only sounds in the vast, frozen theater of the Alps. The mountains seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only the visceral feeling of the cold and the relentless pull of gravity. Hannibal, standing among the ruins of the day's struggle, remained a figure of absolute stillness, his gaze fixed on the higher peaks that still awaited them. The blue-tinted silence of the night was a brief respite, a chance for the survivors to find a few hours of fitful sleep before the next day's climb into the even more hostile environment of the higher glaciers. The ice, reflecting the pale lunar glow, seemed to be creeping down the slopes to meet them, a silent and relentless adversary that required no weapons to kill. The soldier's breath formed a constant, rhythmic mist that enveloped the column in a spectral shroud, hiding the expressions of those who were beginning to doubt the possibility of success. Around the small, blue-tinged fires, men shared stories of the warm sands of Carthage, their voices reduced to whispers that were swallowed by the vastness of the stone. The armor of the fallen was gathered where possible, its cold, metallic weight a burden for those tasked with carrying it forward. In this vertical wilderness, the concept of time began to blur, reduced to the simple cycle of the ascent and the desperate need for warmth. The moon rose higher, casting a harsh, silver light over the jagged edges of the rocks and revealing the immense scale of the climb that still remained. Hannibal's silhouette was a dark, unmoving mark against the luminous snow, a symbol of a willpower that refused to be broken by the indifference of the natural world. The night deepened into a profound, indigo stillness that heralded the coldest hours of the journey, with the frost thickening on every surface and the very air seeming to solidify into a crystalline silence. The journey into the higher elevations of the Alpine range continued with a slow, deliberate pace that tested the very limits of human and animal endurance. As the army reached the 9th day of its odyssey through the vertical wilderness, a wide, windswept plateau eventually revealed itself amidst the jagged peaks, providing a brief and necessary reprieve from the constant, grueling ascent that had claimed so many lives in the days prior. This high-altitude desert was a world of stark, monochromatic beauty, where the deep indigo of the night sky met the pale, frozen crust of the ancient snowfields. Hannibal ordered the column to halt and establish a sprawling encampment across this desolate expanse, allowing the stragglers and the remaining baggage animals to reunite with the main body of the force. The silence of the plateau was profound and heavy, broken only by the mournful, rhythmic sighing of the wind as it channeled through the narrow gaps of the surrounding granite cathedrals. Thousands of soldiers, many of whom hailed from the sun-drenched landscapes of North Africa and Iberia, found themselves in a realm of cold so absolute that it seemed to possess a physical weight. Their breath emerged as constant, spectral plumes of white vapor that drifted and vanished into the crystalline air, while their fingers and limbs grew lethargic under the biting grip of the frost. Around the camp, the fires were kept small and low, casting a faint, blue-tinted light that barely reached beyond the immediate circles of the huddle. The psychological toll of the environment was evident in the quiet, hollow stares of the veterans who sat wrapped in heavy wool cloaks, their eyes fixed on the distant, glowing glaciers that shimmered under the cold light of a silver moon. Academic analysis of this phase of the crossing suggests that the plateau served as a vital strategic gathering point, a moment of stasis where the commander could reassess his remaining strength before the final, perilous descent into the Po Valley. The logistical strain had reached a critical threshold, as the supplies of grain for the men and fodder for the animals dwindled to a precarious level, forcing the quartermasters to manage the rations with a grim, mathematical precision. The 37 elephants, those massive icons of Carthaginian power, stood together in tight groups to conserve their internal heat, their thick hides covered in a fine layer of rime ice that glittered like diamonds in the moonlight. These great creatures moved their trunks with a slow, weary grace, their deep resonant rumbles vibrating through the frozen ground and providing a strange, comforting heartbeat to the camp. Hannibal, ever the vigilant guardian, moved through the rows of sleeping men with a quiet, ghostly presence, his own fatigue hidden behind a mask of unwavering resolve. He spent hours observing the positions of the stars, using the ancient celestial maps to navigate the path forward through a landscape that defied traditional mapping. The air on the plateau was pure and sharp, smelling of nothing but frozen water and the raw mineral scent of the mountains. A sensory void that made the memories of the warm Mediterranean feel like a distant, fading dream. Every metallic clink of a shield or the soft thud of a horse's hoof was amplified by the thin air, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and vast. The blue shadows of the surrounding peaks stretched across the snow like long, reaching fingers, marking the slow rotation of the earth as the army waited for the dawn. This was a moment of profound isolation, a feeling that the army had transcended the world of civilizations and entered a primeval space where only the basic laws of survival remained. The frost thickened on the spears and helmets of the sentries, turning the weaponry into objects of ice and silver, while the horses stood with their heads bowed, their nostrils flared against the chilling draft. The transition to the plateau marked the end of the climb, but it also signaled the beginning of the most desperate struggle against the elements. As the cold became a more persistent enemy than any Roman legion, the stillness of the midnight hour was absolute, a heavy, indigo blanket that muffled the dreams of 30,000 men who lay suspended between the sky and the earth, waiting for the signal to descend into the history of the world. The transition from the high plateau to the southern slopes of the Alps marked the beginning of a descent that was in many ways more treacherous than the climb itself. As the Carthaginian army prepared to move down toward the fertile plains of the Po Valley, a heavy, cold fog rolled in from the lower altitudes, obscuring the path and turning the world into a series of jagged, blue-lit precipices. The southern face of the mountains was significantly steeper and more prone to the accumulation of ice, creating a lethal surface where a single misstep meant a silent fall into the dark voids below. Hannibal watched as his vanguard reached the point where the trail had been completely swept away by a recent landslide, leaving only a narrow, crumbling ledge that was impossible for the heavy baggage animals and the 37 elephants. This obstacle represented a critical moment in the expedition, a logistical nightmare that threatened to strand the entire force in the freezing heights without adequate supplies. The academic consensus describes how the soldiers were forced to attempt a bypass over a fresh layer of snow that had fallen over an older, frozen crust of ice, creating a deceptive and treacherous surface. As the men stepped forward, their feet would break through the soft top layer and slide helplessly on the smooth, glass-like ice underneath, leading to scenes of quiet debate, desperate struggle as they grasped for handholds on the bare rock. The pack animals, burdened with the remaining grain and equipment, suffered the most in this environment, their hooves finding no purchase on the frozen slopes as they slid toward the edges of the cliffs. The silence of the mountain was frequently punctuated by the distant, hollow sound of ice cracking and the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the elephants as they stood motionless, waiting for a path to be carved through the stone. Hannibal directed his engineers and the most able-bodied men to begin the arduous task of cutting a new road into the very face of the mountain. A feat of ancient engineering that required the use of fire and perhaps, as some historical accounts suggest, the application of sour wine to weaken the heated rock. The atmosphere of the camp during these days was one of grim, focused labor, with the blue light of the high-altitude sun reflecting off the massive glaciers and casting long, sharp shadows across the worksite. The scent of burning wood and the sharp, acidic tang of the heated stone filled the thin air, creating a sensory contrast with the biting cold of the surrounding peaks. The soldiers worked in shifts through the day and night, their movements slow and deliberate to conserve their waning strength. Around small, flickering torches that appeared like distant, wandering stars against the dark, vertical landscape, each foot of progress was a victory over the indifference of the geology, a testament to the collective willpower of a force that refused to accept defeat at the hands of nature. The elephants, those magnificent creatures from a different world, remained a silent, imposing presence in the background, their large eyes reflecting the blue shadows and the flickering orange glow of the engineering fires. These titans seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, standing with a patient, weary dignity as they waited for the path to the lowlands to be reopened. The nights on the steep slopes were characterized by a profound indigo stillness, with the stars appearing closer and more brilliant than ever before. Casting a cold, silver radiance over the frozen army, the men huddled against the rock faces, their wool cloaks covered in a layer of frost that glittered in the moonlight, creating a visual landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. The descent was not a rapid march, but a slow, inch-by-inch struggle against the terrain, where time was measured not in hours but in the length of the road carved into the mountain. The air remained sharp and crystalline, carrying no sound from the world below, leaving the army in a state of total, blue-tinged isolation as they worked to bridge the gap between the sky and the plains. The heavy thud of iron tools against stone provided a rhythmic pulse to the encampment, a steady heartbeat that signaled the persistence of human ambition in the face of the eternal ice. The air at the summit of the pass was a thin and icy veil, a substance so cold that it seemed to burn the lungs of the weary Carthaginian soldiers as they reached the highest point of their arduous journey through the heart of the Alps. Around them, the world had become a landscape of pure, crystalline silence, where the jagged peaks of granite and the ancient glaciers reflected a ghostly, pale light from the waning moon. Hannibal stood at the vanguard of his dwindling force, his gaze fixed not on the path they had conquered, but on the hazy, indigo distance to the south where the mountains finally yielded to the vast plains of Italy. The academic consensus notes that at this point, the army had been reduced to a shadow of its former self, with thousands of men and horses lost to the precipices. The cold and the hunger that now gnawed at the survivors with a relentless, rhythmic intensity. The 37 elephants, their skin now cracked and gray from the biting frost, stood huddled together like ancient, weathered stones, their deep and low-frequency rumbles echoing through the frozen valleys as they exhaled plumes of thick, white vapor into the night. The soldiers, wrapped in multiple layers of tattered wool and heavy hides, moved with a lethargic, slow-motion grace, their every step a testament to a willpower that had transcended the limits of biological endurance. There was no sound of triumph or celebration at reaching the summit. Only a heavy, somber stillness that mirrored the indifference of the high-altitude environment. The blue shadows of the peaks stretched for miles across the snowfields, creating a visual labyrinth that seemed to shift and breathe with the movement of the clouds. The scent of the air was sharp and metallic, devoid of the life-affirming smells of the lowlands, reminding every man of the extreme isolation they had sought and achieved. In the small circles of light provided by the few remaining torches, the eyes of the veterans reflected a mixture of exhaustion and a quiet, fatalistic determination. The armor they wore was now a burden of cold metal, clicking softly against their frozen garments with every labored breath. The horses stood with their heads bowed low, their manes frosted with silver rime, their strength almost entirely spent in the service of an ambition they could not comprehend. Hannibal moved among the ranks with the silence of a ghost, his presence a stabilizing anchor in a world that felt increasingly surreal and detached from reality. He looked out over the sea of clouds that blanketed the valleys below, a wide and shifting ocean that separated the army from the promise of the fertile lands they had come to conquer. This was the moment of peak atmospheric tension, where the physical struggle was momentarily suspended in a state of meditative, blue-tinged observation. The stars above were brilliant and cold, appearing as sharp points of light that watched over the freezing camp with a cold, celestial detachment. The silence was so absolute that the men could hear the faint, rhythmic beating of their own hearts, a steady biological drum that defied the encroaching frost. The snow beneath their feet was no longer soft, but had hardened into a glass-like sheet, reflecting the indigo hues of the sky and the pale, shimmering glow of the moon. Every soldier knew that the descent would be just as perilous as the climb. Yet for this brief interval, they existed in a realm between worlds, a space where the history of empires was frozen in time. The logistics of the halt were managed with a silent, mechanical efficiency, as the last of the rations were distributed with a grim, calculated fairness. The heavy trunks of the elephants swayed slowly in the dark, their massive bodies providing a small measure of warmth for the mahouts who slept curled against their legs. The sense of distance from the Mediterranean world was now absolute, as if the army had crossed into a mythological plane of existence where only the elements of stone, ice, and wind held dominion. The blue light of the high mountains deepened into a rich, velvet indigo as the night reached its coldest hour, casting a serene and mournful glow over the thousands of men who dreamed of the sun they had left behind. The texture of the snow was etched with the passage of thousands of feet, yet the wind began to erase these marks with the gentle, persistent dusting of fresh ice. Each man's equipment was a collection of worn leather and pitted bronze, reflecting the harshness of the journey in every scratch and dent. The flags of Carthage, once vibrant and proud, hung limp in the still, freezing air, their colors muted by the pervasive blue of the Alpine night. The camp was a study in stillness, a momentary pause in the relentless forward motion of history, where the focus was reduced to the simple act of survival against the encroaching frost. As the moon reached its zenith, the shadows of the mountains became even more profound, cutting sharp, geometric shapes across the white landscape and creating an environment that was both beautiful and utterly hostile to human life. The silence of the higher peaks was not just an absence of noise, but a physical presence that weighed upon the soul, reinforcing the realization that they were the first great army to ever gaze upon Italy from such a height. The southern slopes of the Alps presented a new and terrifying obstacle as the army began its descent towards the Italian plains. The recent snowfall had blanketed the treacherous terrain in a deceptive layer of white, but beneath this soft, powdery surface lay the remnants of the previous year's winter, a solid, glass-like sheet of ancient ice that had never melted, and now acted as a lethal foundation for the new drifts. This phenomenon, described by the historian Polybius with meticulous detail, created a double layer of snow and ice that proved nearly impassable for the Carthaginian host. When a soldier placed his foot down, he would break through the fresh top layer only to encounter the unyielding, slippery surface of the old ice below, causing his legs to fly out from under him as if he were walking on a frozen lake of glass. Many men, in a desperate attempt to stop their slide toward the sheer precipices that lined the path, tried to crawl on their hands and knees or use their spears as anchors in the frozen crust. But the incline was too steep, and the old ice too hard for any grip to hold. The baggage animals and the remaining horses suffered even more in this vertical world of ice, their hooves breaking through the crust and becoming hopelessly trapped in the frozen layer between the two winters. Often, they would struggle so violently to free themselves that they would lose their footing entirely and tumble down the dark ravines, their heavy loads clattering against the rock faces in a rhythmic, tragic cadence that echoed through the blue-tinged valleys for long seconds after they had disappeared into the mist. The atmosphere was one of profound and heavy frustration, as the soldiers could see the sunlit plains of Italy in the far distance, yet felt as though the mountains were a living entity pulling them back into their frozen depths. The 37 elephants, those massive survivors of the trek through the clouds, faced their greatest trial yet on these southern slopes. Their immense weight, which had been a source of strength in the lowlands, now became a lethal liability as they slid uncontrollably down the narrow tracks. Their large feet finding no purchase on the slick, blue-lit stone, the Mahots worked in a state of quiet, focused desperation, using every technique of their ancient craft to guide the great beasts. But the elephants themselves were visibly shaken by the instability of the ground, their trunks searching the air for a stability that did not exist. The silence of the high altitude was broken only by the sound of sliding metal, the cracking of ice, and the heavy, labored breathing of thousands of men who were reaching the absolute end of their physical strength. The blue shadows of the evening began to crawl up the mountainsides from the valleys below, turning the white landscape into a vast indigo sea, where the only landmarks were the jagged, silver-lit peaks and the dark line of the army snaking through the snow. Hannibal remained at the center of the column, his presence a silent, stabilizing force amidst the chaos of the descent. He observed the struggle with a calm, analytical gaze, calculating the cost of each lost animal and the time required to clear the path for the survivors. The logistical nightmare of moving an entire army down such a slope required constant, minute adjustments to the order of march, ensuring that the most vital equipment and the precious remains of the grain supplies were protected from the frequent slides. The scent of the air was thin and sharp, carrying the metallic tang of cold iron and the ancient smell of frozen water that had been trapped for centuries in the glaciers. Every soldier felt the crushing weight of the isolation, a sense that they were caught in a world of ice that had no end and no mercy for human ambition. The blue light reflected off the southern glaciers in a way that made the mountains seem to glow from within, casting a serene but haunting radiance over the exhausted men as they sought a place to rest for the night. The cold seeped into the marrow of their bones, a persistent, numbing force that slowed their movements and dulled their senses, creating a state of semi-consciousness as they marched toward a horizon that seemed to retreat with every step. The landslide had carved a devastating vertical wound into the side of the mountain, leaving a gap of approximately 1.5 stadia where the path had once provided a precarious link to the lower slopes. The Carthaginian army, exhausted by the double layers of ice and the constant threat of the abyss, now found themselves gathered at the edge of this new, silent barrier. Hannibal realized that the only way forward was to literally carve a passage into the living rock, a task that would require the collective labor of his most resilient engineers and thousands of infantrymen who were already on the brink of collapse. In the deep blue stillness of the Alpine night, the soldiers began to gather wood from the sparse, stunted trees of the lower ridges, dragging the timber up through the snow to create massive pyres against the granite face. As the fires were lit, the orange glow of the embers created a haunting contrast with the monochromatic blue of the surrounding glaciers, reflecting off the bronze armor and the tired faces of the men who stood vigil over the flames. The heat from the fires pressed against the ancient stone, while the soldiers prepared the rations of sour wine and vinegar that remained in their dwindling supplies. Historical accounts describe how this acidic liquid was poured onto the superheated rock, causing the stone to hiss and fracture under the sudden thermal shock, creating cracks that could then be expanded by iron picks and heavy sledgehammers. The sound of metal striking stone became a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse that echoed through the vast, empty valleys, a steady biological rhythm that signaled the persistence of human will in a world of indifferent ice. The elephants, those 37 grey monoliths, were positioned in the rear of the engineering party, their massive trunks swaying in the cold air as they waited for a path wide enough to accommodate their immense bulk. These animals, sensing the danger of the ledge, remained unnervingly still, their large eyes reflecting the flickering fires and the cold, silver light of the moon. The air around the worksite was thick with the scent of wood smoke, pulverized granite, and the sharp, biting smell of the vinegar, a sensory landscape that was both industrial and primeval. Every foot of progress was a grueling victory, won through hours of silent, coordinated effort in an environment where the oxygen was thin and every breath was a frozen struggle. The soldiers worked in shifts, those not on the ledge huddling together for warmth in the depressions of the snow, their wool cloaks becoming stiff with rime as the temperature plummeted during the midnight hours. The blue shadows cast by the engineering fires stretched long and distorted across the white snowfields, making the men appear as giants moving against the scale of the mountains. This was a moment of profound, atmospheric labor, where the history of empires was being forged one hammer blow at a time in the silence of the high Alps. The stars above watched with a cold, celestial detachment, their brilliance undimmed by the thin atmosphere, while the moon cast a serenity over the scene that masked the sheer desperation of the undertaking. Hannibal moved among his men, not as a commander of battle but as a master of logistics, his calm presence ensuring that the distribution of tools and labor remained constant. Even in the face of such an impossible task, the discipline of the Carthaginian host did not waver. Their movements dictated by a rhythmic efficiency that had been honed through years of campaigning across the Mediterranean world. As the path slowly began to take shape, a narrow shelf carved into the precipice, the first of the pack animals were led forward, their hooves clicking nervously on the fresh stone. The transition from the chaos of the landslide to the order of the new road was a psychological turning point, a sign that the mountains could be forced to yield to human ingenuity. The night deepened into a rich, velvet indigo, and the silence of the surrounding peaks returned, absorbing the sounds of the labor into the vast, frozen void. Each man's breath was a silent plume in the moonlight, a reminder of the life that persisted in this vertical desert, and the blue light of the glaciers continued to illuminate the scene with a cold, spectral glow. The passage through the freshly carved rock ledge allowed the vanguard of the Carthaginian army to finally begin the long-awaited descent into the lower southern valleys. But the physical condition of the men and animals had reached a state of near total depletion. The 3 days spent overcoming the landslide and the rock barrier had exhausted the last of the concentrated fodder for the horses and the grain for the infantry, leaving the force in a state of quiet, hollow-eyed starvation as they moved through the deep blue shadows of the late Alpine autumn. The path below the summit was a winding, silver-lit ribbon of mud and melting snow, where the warmer air from the Italian plains began to meet the freezing drafts of the high glaciers, creating a thick, persistent mist that clung to the soldiers' wool cloaks like a damp, heavy shroud. As the column wound its way down, the jagged, vertical landscape of the high Alps began to soften into rolling ridges covered in stunted, frost-bitten pine trees. The first signs of vegetation the men had seen in nearly 2 weeks of barren stone and ice. This transition, though promising, was accompanied by a profound silence that reflected the immense loss of life the army had sustained during the crossing. Academic estimates suggest that a significant portion of the initial force, including thousands of seasoned veterans and countless pack animals, remained behind in the frozen reaches of the peaks, their forms now part of the eternal geography of the mountains. The 37 elephants, the survivors of a journey that defied their biological nature, were now skeletal figures, the ribs clearly visible beneath their thick, grey hides as they moved with a slow, mechanical gait that mirrored the exhaustion of their mahols. These great beasts, once symbols of Carthaginian pride and power, were now merely fellow travelers in a desperate struggle for survival, their deep, resonant groans providing a somber, rhythmic pulse to the descent. Hannibal, riding at the head of his weary officers, maintained a posture of absolute, unmoving focus, his gaze constantly fixed on the southern horizon where the dark, velvet blue of the mountains finally met the pale, misty expanse of the Po Valley. It was at this juncture that the commander gathered his remaining troops at a vantage point to show them the land they had come to conquer. Pointing toward the distant, shimmering plains that represented both their destination and their survival, there was no cheering or shouting, only a collective, labored breath that rose into the cold air as a single, massive plume of vapor. The sight of Italy, though distant and veiled in the nocturnal haze, acted as a psychological anchor for the men, a visual confirmation that the impossible had been achieved. The night on the southern slopes was characterized by a different kind of stillness, a damp, heavy quiet that smelled of wet earth and ancient, decaying leaves, a sharp contrast to the sterile, mineral scent of the high peaks. Around the campfires, the soldiers no longer spoke of home but of fertile fields and the warmth that lay just a few days' march ahead, their voices reduced to low, rhythmic murmurs that were swallowed by the vastness of the forest. The blue moonlight filtered through the canopy of the pines, casting intricate, shifting patterns of shadow across the exhausted forms of the sleeping men, making them appear as part of the mountain itself. The logistical challenge now shifted from overcoming nature to restoring the strength of the army, as the officers calculated the distance to the nearest Gallic settlements where food and rest could be found. Every piece of armor and every weapon was now a cold, heavy weight that felt as though it were bonded to the skin of the soldier who carried it, a physical manifestation of the 15-day odyssey through the clouds. The descent continued through the indigo hours of the night, a slow, rhythmic flow of humanity and animals moving toward the light of a new world, while the peaks behind them remained the silent, silver-lit sentinels of the trials they had endured. The stars above seemed to hang lower, their brilliance softened by the humidity of the valleys, casting a serene, blue-tinged glow over the path that led away from the ice and toward the turning point of history. Each step down was a step toward a different kind of war, one fought on the soil of the enemy, but for now, the focus remained on the simple rhythmic act of walking toward the warmth. The descent from the lower southern ridges was marked by a gradual change in the environment, as the barren stone and ice of the high peaks gave way to dense forests of ancient pine and oak trees. The air, though still cold, began to carry the rich, wet scent of the earth and decaying vegetation, which was a welcome change for the men and animals who had lived in the sterile world of the higher glaciers for over 2 weeks. The path itself was a winding trail of mud and slippery rocks, lubricated by the melting snow and the first seasonal rains of the Italian autumn, and the Carthaginian column, now a spectral line of exhausted figures, moved with a rhythmic, plodding step that reflected the weight of their journey. Hannibal, leading from the front, watched the horizon as the blue shadows of the lower mountains began to merge with the expansive mist of the Po Valley. The state of the army upon reaching the first lower valleys was one of profound depletion. With the initial force of over 40,000 soldiers and countless animals now reduced to roughly 26,000 men who resembled moving corpses more than conquerors, these survivors, their faces etched with the fatigue of starvation and constant battle, moved like ghosts through the forest, their armor clicking softly in the indigo twilight. The 37 elephants, the most resilient of the host, were skeletal figures, their thick hides draped over prominent ribs, moving with a slow, laborious gait as they followed their mahots into the warmer air. As the army reached the first inhabited settlements in the territory of the Insubres and Boi Gauls, the atmosphere shifted from desperation to a quiet, cautious relief. The academic consensus notes that these initial encounters were not hostile. Instead, the local chieftains, who had long simmered resentment towards Roman expansion, greeted Hannibal's emaciated forces as potential allies and provided the vital supplies that the army so desperately needed: rations of grain, fresh meat, and fodder for the remaining animals were distributed, and the sounds of the camp changed from the hollow echoes of the wind to the quiet murmurs of men receiving nourishment for the first time in days. This was a critical period of stasis and restoration, where the strategic genius of the Carthaginian command shifted from overcoming nature to managing logistics of recovery. Hannibal prioritized the health of his troops, knowing that the real conflict with Rome was just beginning, and he utilized the alliance with the Gauls to secure both food and vital intelligence about the political landscape of northern Italy. Around the small, blue-tinted campfires, the soldiers began to shed the frozen layers of their journey, cleaning their pitted armor and sharpening their blades, which had become dull from disuse in the high snows. The blue moonlight filtered through the dense canopy of the oak and pine, casting intricate, shifting patterns on the faces of the resting men, who now dreamed not just of the past but of the battles to come. A profound stillness settled over the encampment. Different from the silence of the peaks, it was the quiet of an army gathering its strength, a moment of deep collective meditation before the inevitable storm. Every clink of a hammer against a sword or the rhythmic breathing of a resting elephant was amplified by the proximity of the forest, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and vast. This halt was a biological imperative, as much as a strategic necessity, allowing the soldiers to reclaim their humanity after the brutalizing experience of the crossing. The history of the world hung in balance during these quiet nights, as the first great invader to conquer the Alps prepared to unleash his force upon the heart of the Roman Republic. The descent finally reached its terminus in the wide, fertile plains of northern Italy, where the landscape unfolded into a vast, misty expanse that felt both alien and welcoming to the survivors of the high peaks. The transition from the razor-sharp air of the glaciers to the heavy, damp atmosphere of the glaciers to the heavy, damp atmosphere of the Po Valley was a visceral change, affecting the breath and the movements of every man and animal in the Carthaginian host. As the army established its first major encampment on level ground, the scale of their achievement was overshadowed by the sheer physical cost of the crossing. The soldiers moved with a slow, rhythmic lethargy, their bodies having adapted to the constant struggle against gravity and now finding the flat earth almost surreal. Around the camp, the indigo mists of the Italian night rose from the rivers and the damp soil, creating a world of soft edges and hidden depths, where the silhouettes of the tents and the tethered horses appeared as dark, indistinct islands in a sea of blue. The smell of the plains was a complex mixture of wet grass, river silt, and the faint, metallic scent of the armor that was finally being stripped of its layer of alpine frost. Hannibal, ever the silent observer, stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the southern horizon where the Roman Republic lay in wait. Unaware of the magnitude of the threat that had just descended from the clouds, the silence of the plains was different from the silence of the mountains. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, filled with the low, resonant sounds of the valley. The rustle of reeds in the wind, the distant cry of a night bird, and the rhythmic, steady breathing of the 37 elephants that had survived the impossible. These great creatures, their skins still mapped with the scars of the ice, stood knee-deep in the lush, damp grass, their trunks moving with a slow, exploratory grace as they rediscovered the abundance of the lowlands. The logistical focus of the command was now centered on the immediate restoration of the cavalry, the vital arm of the Carthaginian war machine that would soon be tested against the Roman legions. The horses, skeletal and weary, were groomed with a quiet, mechanical precision, their coats reflecting the pale, silver light of the moon as it filtered through the high, thin clouds. Every clink of a harness and every thud of a hoof on the soft earth was a reminder of the transition from a battle against nature to a battle against an empire. The atmosphere was one of profound, blue-tinged meditation, a moment in time where the past horrors of the crossing and the future violence of the invasion were suspended in a state of perfect stasis. The soldiers, huddling around low, flickering fires, did not speak of glory, but shared the silent, mutual recognition of their survival, their faces illuminated by a soft, orange glow that barely pierced the surrounding darkness. The night air was thick and cool, carrying the humidity of the nearby rivers and the ancient scent of the Italian soil. A sensory reality that grounded the men in their new mission. The stars above were softened by the haze of the valley, appearing as distant, blurred points of light that watched over the camp with a calm, celestial indifference. Hannibal's silhouette was a dark, unmoving pillar against the vastness of the plain, representing a willpower that had conquered the Alps and was now preparing to challenge the very foundations of Rome. This was the threshold of a new chapter in history, where the silence of the night was the only witness to the gathering strength of an army that had defied the gods of the mountains. The blue shadows of the night stretched across the fertile land, marking the slow, inevitable approach of the first encounter on the banks of the Ticinus, where the quiet of the plains would finally be shattered by the sound of the trumpet. The tents, constructed from heavy hides and tattered wool, were arranged in precise rows, a testament to the enduring discipline that Hannibal had maintained even in the face of near annihilation. Within these structures, the soldiers lay in a state of deep, restorative sleep, their dreams filled with the rhythmic echoes of the mountain winds and the sudden, jarring silence of the plains. The mud of the valley floor, rich and dark, clung to the sandals of the sentries who paced the perimeter, their movements as steady and predictable as the turning of the stars. The Numidian cavalrymen, perhaps the most resilient of the host, spent the midnight hours tending to their small, wiry horses, whispering to them in the melodic languages of the desert, their voices a low hum that blended with the sound of the flowing river. The Ticinus, a silver ribbon in the moonlight, moved with a slow, persistent current, its waters carrying the melted ice of the very mountains they had just escaped. The reflection of the moon on the surface of the river was a shimmering, fractured dance of light, echoing the instability of the political world that Hannibal was about to disrupt. The Iberian infantrymen, known for their stoicism, sat in small groups, their swords resting across their knees, the cold metal absorbing the blue light of the night. These men, who had followed Hannibal from the Tagus to the Po, were the hardened core of the army, their eyes reflecting a quiet, fatalistic loyalty that needed no words. The atmosphere of the camp was thick with the scent of wet leather, wood smoke, and the sharp, earthy tang of the valley. A sensory landscape that was both heavy and comforting. Every breath taken in the humid air was a reminder of the life that remained, a rhythmic pulse that defied the frozen death of the higher elevations. The 37 elephants, the survivors of the crossing, moved their massive ears with a slow, fanning motion, their large bodies creating deep, dark shadows on the damp grass. These animals were the living embodiment of the Carthaginian spirit, enduring, imposing, and utterly out of place in the Italian landscape, yet their presence provided a source of silent strength for the men who looked upon them. The Carthaginian encampment on the wide, fertile banks of the Ticinus River was a study in restored discipline and quiet anticipation, as the army utilized the final weeks of the Italian autumn to recover from the ordeal of the high passes. The land was rich and damp, exhaling a thick, blue-gray mist that rose from the slow-moving water and drifted through the rows of tents, blurring the distinction between the solid earth and the nocturnal sky. The air was heavy with the scent of wet grass, the raw mineral tang of the river silt, and the faint, metallic aroma of oil being worked into bronze and iron armor, which had been pitted and dulled by the corrosive frost of the high Alps. Around the small, low-contrast fires, the soldiers moved with a rhythmic, measured lethargy, their bodies gradually absorbing the nutrients and warmth of the lowlands, their minds transitioning from the desperate struggle for survival against nature to the calculated requirements of impending warfare. Historical consensus notes that during this brief period of stasis, Hannibal's intelligence network, operating within the sympathetic Gallic tribes, provided critical information regarding the movements of the Roman consul Bullius Cornelius Scipio, who had unexpectedly returned from Spain and was now advancing north with a scratch force to intercept the invaders. The Punic commander recognized that the first encounter on Italian soil was of paramount psychological importance, a chance to prove to his men and to the wary Gallic allies that the Roman legions were not invincible. The atmosphere of the camp was one of deep, blue-tinged meditation, a suspended moment where the horrors of the crossing were fading into memory and the violence of the invasion was yet to be unleashed. Hannibal moved through the indigo shadows with the silence of a ghost, his presence a stabilizing force among the troops, his gaze frequently turning toward the eastern horizon where the Ticinus flowed, its surface a shimmering, fractured mirror for the pale, silver light of the moon. The 37 elephants, their massive forms draped in the shifting indigo mists, stood together near the riverbank, their breath creating plumes of vapor that merged with the fog, their deep, resonant rumbles, a low-frequency pulse that resonated through the damp earth. These animals were no longer the skeletal figures of the peaks, having gorged themselves on the abundant forage of the plain, their hides now reflecting the cool light with a renewed, imposing luster. The Numidian cavalry, the vital, mobile hearts of the Punic host, spent the midnight hours tending to their mounts. The small wiry horses standing with heads bowed, their nostrils flared against the chilling draught that carried the scent of the Roman advance. The preparation for battle was not chaotic, but orderly, a quiet mobilization of resources and willpower. Every clink of a bridle, every soft thud of a hoof on the soft soil was amplified by the profound stillness of the night. The river itself moved with a slow, persistent current, its waters carrying the melted ice of the very mountains the army had conquered, a silent, fluid link to the geography they had just escaped. The stars above were veiled by the humid haze of the valley, appearing as soft, diffused points of light that watched over the camp with a calm, celestial indifference. Hannibal's silhouette was a dark, unmoving vertical line against the vast, horizontal expanse of the plain, a figure of absolute focus calculating the vectors of the coming clash. This was the threshold of the first test of Punic tactical superiority on Italian soil, where the quiet of the night was the only witness to the gathering strength of an army that had defied the natural world and was now preparing to challenge the masters of the Mediterranean. The blue shadows of the night stretched across the fertile land, marking the slow, inevitable approach of the moment when the silence of the plains would finally be shattered by the sound of the trumpet. Within the tents, The soldiers lay in a deep, restorative sleep. Their dreams no longer of ice and falling animals, but of the sharp, sudden clash of metal that lay only a few days ahead. The mud of the riverbank, rich and dark, clung to the sandals of the sentries who paced the perimeter, their movements a steady, predictable rhythm that provided a comforting cadence to the night. The Ticinus, a silver ribbon in the moonlight, continued its ancient flow, unaware that its name would soon be associated with the opening moves of a war that would redefine the ancient world. The Ticinus River flowed with a cold, rhythmic persistence, its waters reflecting the pale, silver light of the moon as it began its descent toward the western horizon. The Carthaginian host, now partially restored by the resources of their Gallic allies, stood poised on the threshold of their first major engagement with the Roman Republic. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the Roman consul, had advanced his legions across the Po, establishing a bridgehead that signaled the beginning of the tactical struggle for northern Italy. The night before the encounter was characterized by a profound indigo stillness, a heavy, expectant quiet that enveloped the valley in a shroud of blue mist and damp earth. Hannibal, moving through the rows of tethered horses, observed the condition of his Numidian cavalry, those swift and elusive riders who would prove to be the decisive factor in the coming clash. Their horses, small and wiry, stood with flared nostrils, their breath forming white vapor clouds that merged with the pervasive fog of the riverbank. The air was thick with the scent of wet grass, the raw mineral tongue of the silt, and the faint, metallic aroma of iron blades being honed in the shadows. Around the low-contrast fires, the soldiers moved with a slow, measured grace, their faces etched with a quiet, fatalistic determination as they prepared for the sudden, jarring violence of the morning. Academic consensus describes the Battle of Ticinus not as a full-scale infantry engagement, but as a significant cavalry skirmish that highlighted the superior mobility and tactical flexibility of the Punic forces. Hannibal's plan was a study in predatory precision, utilizing his heavy cavalry in the center to fix the Roman line, while the Numidians on the flanks were tasked with sweeping around to strike the Roman rear. As the first light of a cold, gray dawn began to pierce the blue mist, the two forces met on the open plain, the sound of thundering hooves and clashing metal shattering the silence of the valley. The Roman velites, the light infantry scouts, were quickly overwhelmed by the speed of the Carthaginian charge. Forced to retreat through the intervals of their own cavalry, the struggle was brief but intense, a whirlwind of dust and shadows where the Numidians, riding without saddles or bridles, moved with a fluidity that the rigid Roman formations could not match. In the heat of the clash, Consul Scipio was wounded and nearly captured, only saved by the extraordinary intervention of his young son, the future Scipio Africanus, who charged into the fray to rescue his father. By the time the sun had reached its zenith, the Roman forces were in full retreat back across the river, leaving the field to Hannibal and his victorious, though weary, troops. The night following the victory was one of deep, reflective silence, the camp once again shrouded in the indigo shadows of the Ticinus. The 37 elephants, though they had played a minimal role in this specific engagement, stood as massive, silent sentinels on the perimeter, their large eyes reflecting the flickering orange embers of the victory fires. The sense of triumph was tempered by the realization that this was only the first of many tests, a prelude to the massive infantry battles that would soon define the war. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of wet leather, wood smoke, and the copper tang of the blood, a sensory reminder of the transition from a struggle against nature to a struggle against nature to a struggle against main. Every clink of a harness and every rhythmic breath of a resting soldier was amplified by the profound quiet of the plain, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. The stars above were sharp and cold, watching over the victorious camp with a calm, celestial indifference. Hannibal's silhouette remained a dark, unmoving mark against the vastness of the river valley, his mind already calculating the next stage of his grand design. The blue light of the moon continued to illuminate the scene, casting a serene and mournful glow over the path that led deeper into the heart of the Republic. The immediate aftermath of the skirmish at the Ticinus River saw a significant shift in the strategic landscape of northern Italy, as the wounded consul Publius Cornelius Scipio executed a rapid, nighttime retreat across the Po River to the fortified Roman colony of Placentia, a movement intended to preserve his legionary corps and consolidate his forces under the protection of established walls. The Carthaginian army, enveloped in the deep, indigo mists that rose from the damp river banks and the surrounding marshlands, observed the Roman withdrawal with a quiet, calculated satisfaction, their spirits buoyed by this initial proof of tactical superiority on Italian soil. The atmosphere in Hannibal's camp was one of profound, blue-tinged meditation, a suspended interval where the visceral echoes of cavalry charges were fading into the heavy, expectant silence of the Po Valley. Historically, this period was critical for the influx of Gallic allies, who, witnessing the Roman retreat, flocked to Hannibal's banners, bringing vital provisions, fresh horses, and thousands of warriors eager to challenge the hegemony of the Republic around the Punic campfires, which burned with a low, soft orange glow against the pervasive indigo shadows. The sounds of Punic, Numidian, Iberian, and now Celtic dialects mingled in a low rhythmic murmur, creating a soundscape that reflected the diverse and growing nature of the invading host. The 37 elephants, those massive survivors of the Alpine frost, stood together near the supply lines, their forms draped in the shifting fogs, their deep, slow breathing a comforting biological pulse that resonated through the earth. These great creatures were gradually regaining their strength, their hides now reflecting the cool, silver light of the moon with the renewed, imposing luster. Hannibal utilized these quiet hours to reorganize his command structure and incorporate the Gallic contingents, moving through the camp with a silent, ghost-like presence, his mind already analyzing the terrain leading toward Placentia and the Trebia River. The air on the plains was heavy and cool, carrying the scent of wet grass, river silt, wood smoke, and the faint, metallic aroma of iron being worked in the shadows. Every clink of a hammer against a sword or the rhythmic breathing of a resting soldier was amplified by the profound stillness of the night, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. The stars above were softened by the humid haze, appearing as soft, diffused points of light that watched over the gathering storm with a calm, celestial indifference. Hannibal's silhouette remained a dark, unmoving vertical line against the vast, horizontal expanse of the plain, a figure of absolute focus calculating the vectors of the coming confrontation. This was the threshold of the first major clash of infantry, where the quiet of the night was the only witness to the gathering strength of an army that had defied the natural world and was now preparing to challenge the legions of Rome in a pitched battle. The blue shadows of the night stretched across the fertile land, marking the slow, inevitable approach of the moment when the silence of the plains would finally be shattered by the sound of the trumpet, and the waters of the Trebia would run red in the cold light of a December dawn. Within the tents, the soldiers lay in a deep, restorative sleep, their dreams filled with the sharp, sudden clash of metal that lay only a few days ahead. The mud of the valley floor, rich and dark, clung to the sandals of the sentries who paced the perimeter, their movements a steady, predictable rhythm that provided a comforting cadence to the night, a silent, fluid link to the geography they were destined to reshape through conflict. The month of December in the year 218, before the Common Era, brought an intensifying, bitter cold to the Po Valley, a climatic shift that would profoundly influence the impending confrontation between the forces of Carthage and the Roman Republic. The Roman army, now consolidated near the colony of Placentia after the retreat from Ticinus, had been reinforced by the arrival of the second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, who had completed a rapid and arduous march from Sicily with his legions. Sempronius, unlike the wounded and cautious Scipio, was eager for a decisive battle, a sentiment fueled by a minor successful skirmish with Carthaginian foragers and the looming end of his consular term. Hannibal, observing the Roman eager positioning from his encampment across the Trebia River, recognized the impetuous nature of the new consul and began to formulate a tactical trap. The setting for this grand strategic maneuver was a landscape defined by the deep blue and indigo shadows of the Italian winter night, where a thick, freezing mist rose from the waters of the Trebia and blanked the surrounding plains and brush-choked ravines, creating a world of muted sounds and obscured visions. Around the Punic campfires, which were kept low to conserve fuel and hide the true extent of the forces, the soldiers moved with a rhythmic, slow-motion grace, their breath forming constant. Spectral plumes that merged with the pervasive fog, the atmosphere was one of profound, blue-tinged meditation. A suspended moment in time where the memory of the Alpine ice was met by the reality of the Italian frost. Hannibal utilized these quiet hours for meticulous preparation, directing his brother Mago to select an elite force of 1,000 cavalry and 1,000 light infantry to conceal themselves in a deep, overgrown watercourse that bisected the plain between the two camps, a masterstroke of ambush intended to strike the Roman rear once the main engagement had commenced. The 37 elephants, those massive survivors of the trek through the clouds, stood together near the center of the lines, their thick hides covered in a fine layer of rime that glittered under the pale, silver light of the moon. Their deep, low-frequency rumbles providing a somber, rhythmic pulse to the encampment. These great creatures were the living icons of Hannibal's defiance, enduring the brutal cold with a stoic, weary dignity as they waited for the signal to advance into the freezing waters. The air on the plains was sharp and heavy with humidity, carrying the scent of wet leather, wood smoke, the raw mineral tang of the river silt, and the faint, metallic aroma of iron being worked in the shadows. Every clink of a harness and every thud of a hoof on the frozen earth was amplified by the profound stillness of the night, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. The stars above were softened by the humid haze, appearing as soft, diffused points of light that watched over the gathering storm with a calm, celestial indifference. Hannibal's silhouette remained a dark, unmoving vertical line against the vast, horizontal expanse of the plain, a figure of absolute focus calculating the vectors of the coming clash. This was the threshold of the first great pitched battle on Italian soil, where the quiet of the night was the only witness to the gathering strength of an army that had defied the natural world and was now preparing to challenge the legions of Rome in a conflict that would redefine the ancient world. The blue shadows of the night stretched across the frozen land, marking the slow, inevitable approach of the moment when the silence of the plains would finally be shattered by the sound of the trumpet and the waters of the Trebia would run red in the cold light of a December dawn. Within the tents, the soldiers lay in a deep, restorative sleep, their dreams filled with the sharp, sudden clash of metal that lay only a few hours ahead. While the mist continued to weave its ghostly patterns through the rows of sleeping men, a silent, fluid link to the geography they were destined to reshape through conflict. The dawn of the Battle of the Trebia broke over a landscape paralyzed by a brutal, crystalline frost, as the Carthaginian army began its meticulously planned provocation of the Roman legions. Hannibal, having ensured his troops were well fed and warmed by great fires within the camp, ordered his men to rub their bodies with olive oil to protect against the biting humidity and the Donderuku cold of the river valley. This was a master stroke of physiological preparation, contrasting sharply with the state of the Roman soldiers who were suddenly roused from their sleep by the Carthaginian Numidian cavalry harassing their outposts in the dim blue light of the morning. Sempronius, driven by a desire for immediate glory and fearing the expiration of his consular term, ordered his legions to pursue the elusive and mocking Numidians, forcing his men to cross the Trebia River without having eaten and without any protection against the freezing waters that reached up to their chests. As the Romans waded through the ice-laden stream, the core temperature of the soldiers plummeted, their limbs becoming numb and their strength drained by the relentless, unforgiving current. The blue light of the winter morning reflected off the surface of the river, creating a scene of haunting, monochromatic beauty where the sounds of clashing shields were muffled by the thick, persistent mist that clung to the frozen reeds. The Carthaginian forces, standing in dry, orderly lines on the western bank, watched with a quiet, clinical detachment as the Roman formations struggled to maintain their cohesion in the freezing mud and water. The 37 elephants, positioned on the flanks like ancient, unmoving monoliths, added a layer of psychological terror to the scene, their massive forms draped in the shifting indigo fogs, their breath forming dense clouds of vapor that drifted across the battlefield like ghostly spirits. The academic consensus highlights this moment as one of the most significant examples of tactical manipulation in ancient warfare, where the environment was weaponized as effectively as any blade or spear. The silence of the dawn was gradually replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thud of marching boots and the low, resonant rumbles of the elephants, a soundscape that signaled the start of a conflict that would change the course of Mediterranean history. Every movement of the Punic troops was a study in discipline and economy, while the Roman advance was marked by a desperate, shivering struggle against the elements that sapped their will to fight. The scent of the air was a sharp mixture of wet iron, river silt, and the faint, acidic smell of the olive oil, a sensory landscape that defined the transition from preparation to the sudden, jarring reality of total war. The stars had faded into a pale, indigo sky, leaving the battlefield in a state of soft, diffused light that masked the expressions of the men who were about to die in the cold. Hannibal's silhouette remained a dark, unmoving pillar at the center of his lines, his gaze fixed on the center of the Roman advance, his mind already calculating the timing of Mago's ambush from the hidden watercourse nearby. The blue shadows of the night gave way to the gray shadows of the day, yet the pervasive monochromatic atmosphere remained, casting a serene and somber glow over the thousands of men who were caught in the gears of a grand strategic design. The ice on the reeds along the riverbank crackled under the weight of the forces, a small, rhythmic sound that was lost in the growing roar of the confrontation. Within the Roman ranks, the exhaustion was profound, a heavy, leaden weight that slowed their sword arms and dulled their reflexes, while the Punic soldiers remained alert and agile, their bodies functioning with a mechanical efficiency that had been preserved through Hannibal's foresight and care. The Trebia, once a simple river, had become a lethal barrier, its waters carrying the fate of empires in its freezing flow. The reflection of the pale sun on the water was a fractured, glittering dance of light, mirroring the instability of the Republic's fortunes on this cold, December morning. The flags of the legions, heavy with moisture and frost, hung limp against their poles. Their colors faded into the surrounding blue of the winter valley. This was the threshold of the first great slaughter, where the quiet of the morning was the prelude to a carnage that would echo through the centuries. The mud of the riverbank, churned by thousands of feet, became a slick indigo trap for those who fell, their last moments spent in the silent, frozen embrace of the Italian earth. The rhythmic chanting of the Celtic allies joined the low hum of the Punic veterans, creating a vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the frozen valley. Every breath taken by the tens of thousands of combatants created a collective, swirling cloud of mist. The Battle of the Trebia commenced in earnest as the two massive infantry formations collided in the center of the misty plain. The sound of the initial impact was a dull, heavy thud that was absorbed by the thick layer of frost covering the ground and the dense humidity of the December morning. The Roman legionaries, despite their profound numbness and hunger, fought with the characteristic desperation of men trapped far from home, their shivering bodies relying on instinct and drilling as they pushed against the Punic center. Hannibal's line, composed of Iberian, Libyo-Phoenician, and newly recruited Celtic troops, held firm but gave ground slowly. A deliberate maneuver intended to draw the Roman heavy infantry deeper into the valley and away from their avenues of retreat. On the flanks, the Carthaginian heavy cavalry and the elusive Numidians quickly overwhelmed their outnumbered Roman counterparts, who were already disorganized by the terror caused by the sight and scent of the 37 elephants. These massive creatures, positioned like grey fortresses on the wings, added a layer of psychological horror to the scene. Their deep, resonant rumbles, vibrating through the frozen earth and muffling the cries of the wounded and dying. The turning point, according to historical accounts, came when Hannibal Barca and his elite force of 2,000 men emerged from the hidden, brush-choked watercourse in the Roman rear. The sound of their unexpected battle cry was a sudden, sharp crack of sound in the silence of the fog, signaling the completion of the strategic trap. The Roman army, now surrounded on all sides and with the freezing river to their backs, was thrown into a state of chaotic, fatalistic panic. The soldiers, their limbs frozen and their energy completely depleted by the cold and hunger, could no longer wield their heavy shields or swing their swords effectively. The olive oil on the Carthaginian skin providing a vital layer of insulation that allowed them to move with a lethal agility. The slaughter that followed was characterized by a profound, somber silence, as the Punic troops methodically cut through the trapped formations, with the only sounds being the soft thuds of bodies falling into the mud and the rhythmic splashing of those who tried to flee into the river. The Trebia, once a simple stream, became a lethal barrier. The Trebia, once a simple stream, became a lethal barrier, its waters carrying thousands of the defeated downstream, their forms quickly vanishing into the cold, indigo mist. While a corps of approximately 10,000 Roman legionaries managed to break through Hannibal's center and retreat in good order to Placentia, the bulk of the army was lost in the Annihilation, making the Trebia the first great defeat of Rome on its own soil. The atmosphere of the battlefield in the afternoon was one of profound, blue-tinged quiet as the soft, unrelenting snow began to cover the thousands of silent figures lying in the mud. The remaining elephants stood motionless over the victory field, their large eyes reflecting the cold, silver light of the declining sun, their breath a final, spectral mist in the freezing twilight. Every breath taken by the survivors was a reminder of the life that remained, a rhythmic pulse that defied the frozen death of the valley. Hannibal, standing amidst the silence of his victory, remained a figure of absolute focus, his mind already calculating the political consequences of this triumph and the path deeper into the heart of Italy. The flags of Rome, tattered and soaked in the cold mud, lay abandoned on the field. Their colors faded into the pervasive blue of the winter afternoon. The Trebia, now a silver ribbon in the moonlight, continued its ancient flow, its waters carrying the memory of a battle that had redefined the ancient world. The transition from the blood-soaked banks of the Trebia to the winter quarters in northern Italy was marked by a shift from the violence of active combat to the slow, grinding attrition of a brutal winter. Hannibal's army, though victorious, found itself in a state of precarious survival as the temperatures plummeted and the supply lines from the Gallic tribes began to strain under the weight of feeding thousands of men and animals. The atmosphere of the Po Valley in early 217 before the Common Era was one of chromatochromatic indigo shadows and persistent, freezing mists that rose from the damp earth and settled in the lungs of the survivors. The most significant loss during this period was the rapid decline of the 37 African forest elephants, creatures born for the equatorial heat, now succumbing to the relentless frost and the lack of proper forage. One by one, these massive titans of the Carthaginian war machine fell into the frozen mud, their deep, resonant rumbles growing faint until they were swallowed by the silence of the winter nights. Academic accounts confirm that by the time the spring thaw began, only a single elephant remained, the great Surus, whose resilience became a symbol of the army's enduring will. The logistical pressure was compounded by the growing restlessness of the Gallic allies, who had expected a rapid victory and instead found their lands drained by the needs of a hungry invading force. Hannibal, ever the master of psychological and physical security, was forced to constantly change his appearance to protect himself from potential assassination attempts by dissatisfied Celtic chieftains. This environment of suspicion and cold was the crucible in which the next phase was forged, as the first signs of a pale, grey spring emerged. Hannibal made the strategic decision to move south into Etruria, choosing a route that the Roman consuls considered impassable. This path led through the flooded marshes of the Arno River, a region where the winter rains had turned the land into a vast, trackless ocean of stagnant water and thick, blue-tinted mud. For 4 days and 3 nights, the Carthaginian column waded through knee-deep water. Finding no dry ground to rest their weary limbs, the soldiers, still recovering from the Alpine crossing, moved like rhythmic ghosts through the reeds, their armor clicking softly against the sounds of splashing water and the low, mournful calls of marsh birds. The lack of sleep and the constant dampness led to widespread disease and exhaustion. With many men and animals drowning in the hidden sinkholes of the swamp, Hannibal himself, riding the lone survivor Surus, suffered a severe ophthalmic infection due to the noxious vapors and the lack of rest, eventually losing the sight in one eye. This loss was borne with a quiet, stoic dignity that further solidified his legend among the troops. The atmosphere of the marshes was one of profound, heavy isolation, a blue world where the horizon was lost in the fog and the only sense of direction came from the southward flow of the water. Every step was a victory over the lethargy of the swamp, a rhythmic pulse of human ambition pushing through a landscape that defied civilization. The stars above were often hidden by the thick canopy of mist, leaving the army to navigate by the pale, silver light of a moon that seemed to float on the surface of the water. Emerging from the suffocating grip of the Arno marshes, the Carthaginian army found itself in a landscape that was both a blessing and a strategic opportunity. The rolling hills of Etruria, touched by the pale blue lights of the early spring, offered dry ground and fertile fields. Yet the column moved with a slow, rhythmic exhaustion, their bodies still carrying the damp weight of the stagnant water and the mud. This transition was not marked by celebration, but by a profound, somber focus. as Hannibal, now a figure of singular, one-eyed vision, surveyed the terrain with a clinical, predatory grace, his loss of sight in one eye being borne with a quiet, stoic dignity that solidified his legend among the troops. The two Roman consuls, Flaminius and Servilius, had been positioned at Aricium and Ariminum to block the traditional avenues of invasion, but Hannibal's impossible march through the floods had rendered their defensive lines obsolete. This strategic bypass created a profound indigo stasis, where the Roman command was paralyzed by confusion, not knowing where the invaders would strike next. Hannibal, ever the master of psychological and physical security, understood that Flaminius, a populist general eager for a personal victory, could be manipulated. The Carthaginian commander began a campaign of calculated devastation, burning the rich farms and villages of Etruria, the smoke rising like distant, spectral plumes in the moonlight, a visual signal to the Romans of their own vulnerability. This act of destruction was a form of psychological warfare, designed to goad the hot-headed consul into a rash and unsupported assault. The fires of Etruria, appearing as small, distant, glowing jewels in the velvet dark, served as the only markers of human ambition in a world dominated by the ancient, indisparate hills. The nights in the hills were bathed in a deep, velvet blue, a quiet stillness that masked the intensity of the human passions playing out below. Around the Carthaginian campfires, which cast soft orange glows that barely pierced the surrounding darkness, the soldiers moved like ghosts, sharpening their blades and repairing their gear with a silent, mechanical efficiency. The scent of wet leather, pulverized stone, and the faint, metallic tang of iron filled the air, creating a sensory landscape that was both ancient and immediate. Surus, the lone survivor of the great elephant herd, stood near the commander's tent, its massive form creating a dark, unmoving monolith against the stars, its deep, resonant breathing a rhythmic heartbeat for the encampment. Hannibal utilized the terrain of Etruria with a surgeon's precision, mapping the defiles, the heights, and the narrow valley of Lake Trasimene where an entire army could be hidden in plain sight. The intelligence network, composed of local Gauls and spies, provided constant, minute updates on the movements of Flaminius, who, enraged by the burning of his province and the mockery of the Senate, was now marching north in a state of righteous but blind fury. Every clink of a harness and every soft thud of a hoof on the soft soil was amplified by the profound stillness of the night, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. The stars above were softened by the humid haze, appearing as soft, diffused points of light that watched over the gathering storm with a calm, celestial indifference. Hannibal understood that the moment of maximum advantage was approaching, a point where the terrain and the psychology of his opponent would merge perfectly. As the indigo shadows of the early Etrurian spring deepened into the profound stillness of a moonless night, Hannibal Barca finalized the details of a tactical masterpiece that would exploit both the geography of Italy and the impetuous nature of the Roman command. He had identified the north shore of Lake Trasimene as the ideal site for an ambush, a location where the steep, tree-covered hills rose sharply from the water, leaving only a narrow, restrictive path for any marching army to pass. Under the cover of the dense white mist that rose from the cool lake waters and blanked the surrounding landscape, the Carthaginian commander moved his diverse forces into their assigned positions on the heights, executing a silent, nocturnal mobilization that left the Roman scouts unaware of the trap that was closing around them. The Gallic allies and Spanish light infantry were positioned along the upper slopes of the hills, their dark silhouettes lost amidst the oaks and pines, while the veteran Libyo-Phoenician heavy infantry were stationed near the exit of the defile, their bronze armor reflecting only the pale blue light of the setting moon. Hannibal positioned his heavy and Numidian cavalry near the entrance of the defile, ready to close the circle once the Roman main body had entered the valley. The atmosphere was one of heavy, expectant stillness, a moment in time where the breath of tens of thousands of men was held in unison, creating a soundscape that was defined not by noise but by the profound absence of it. The waters of the lake were a dark, unmoving vertical surface, reflecting the indigo sky and the distant, blurred points of the stars. The scent of the air was a rich mixture of wet grass, river silt, and the faint, metallic aroma of iron blades being kept silent and sharp in the shadows. This was the threshold of the greatest ambush in ancient history, where the quiet of the night was the only witness to the gathering strength of an army that had defied the natural world and was now preparing to annihilate a Roman legion through the art of concealed geometry. Hannibal, a master of logistics and terrain, moved along the ridges with the quiet grace of a predator, inspecting the lines one final time, ensuring that the separation between the groups remained precise. Inside the defile, the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius, a populist general driven by a dangerous combination of rage and ambition, was already on the march. Having roused his troops before dawn, eager to overtake and punish the Punic invaders who had ravaged his province, his decision to advance without adequate scouting was a critical error, a product of the strategic paralysis Hannibal had engineered. The silence of the night in the valley was a deceptive piece, a mask that hid the predatory intent of an entire host suspended on the slopes above. Every clink of a harness and every thud of a hoof on the soft soil within the Roman column was amplified by the surrounding silence, creating a steady, rhythmic pulse that was heard only by the Punic sentries who watched from the heights. This stasis of anticipation was the culmination of a plan forged in the aftermath of the marshes, a moment where the history of the ancient world held its breath. The dawn of the Battle of Lake Trasimene broke over a landscape submerged in a profound, ethereal white mist that rose from the cool waters and blanked the narrow valley, obscuring the vision of the marching Roman legions and muffling the rhythmic clatter of their armor and footsteps. Gaius Flaminius, driven by an impetuous desire to engage the Carthaginian invaders, led his troops into the defile without adequate scouting, his mind focused on the perceived retreat of Hannibal Barca, while the Punic forces waited in absolute, predatory silence on the tree-covered heights above. The atmosphere was one of suspended animation, a heavy stasis where the only sounds were the slow, steady breathing of thousands of men and the distant, haunting call of a marsh bird. Hannibal, observing the Roman column snake its way along the lakeside path, finally gave the coordinated signal, a trumpet blast that shattered the stillness of the indigo twilight and echoed through the surrounding hills with a jarring, resonant frequency. The slopes above the Romans ignited with the sound of thousands of charging men, as the Gallic allies and Spanish light infantry descended like a torrent from the fog, striking the Roman flank with devastating force before a single legionary could form a coherent battle line. Simultaneously, the Carthaginian heavy cavalry and the elusive Numidians closed the entrance and exit of the defile, completing the circle of annihilation and trapping the entire Roman consular army against the unyielding, deep blue surface of the lake. The confusion among the Romans was absolute, a chaotic, fatalistic panic exacerbated by the thick mist that masked the numbers and positions of their attackers, making it impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Academic accounts detail how the Roman soldiers, their limbs heavy with the morning chill and the sudden terror of the ambush, were unable to maneuver or even draw their weapons in the crushing press of humanity. The soundscape of the valley transformed from silence to a horrific medley of clashing bronze, the guttural shouts of the Celtic warriors, and the low, rhythmic thuds of bodies falling into the mud. Consul Flaminius himself, fighting with desperate fury to rally his troops, was cut down by an Insubrian horseman, his death signaling the final collapse of Roman resistance. As the struggle intensified near the water's edge, thousands of legionaries, driven by the relentless Punic advance, waded into the lake in a futile attempt to escape, only to drown under the immense weight of their heavy armor, their silent struggles beneath the indigo surface marking the boundary between the world of the living and the dead. The slaughter lasted for 3 hours, a methodical, clinical erasure of a Roman army in the quiet light of a spring morning. By the time the mist eventually dissipated, revealing the sunlit beauty of the Etrurian hills, the north shore of Lake Trasimene was covered in a thick, somber layer of the fallen. Hannibal, standing amidst the silence of his masterpiece, remained a figure of unmoving focus, his mind already calculating the strategic implications of this total victory and the route toward Rome. The flags of the legions lay abandoned in the reeds, their colors faded into the pervasive blue and gray of the battlefield. Every breath taken by the Punic survivors was a plume of white vapor, a reminder of the life that persisted in the horizontal desert of conflict. The silence of the lake returned, absorbing the echoes of the carnage into its ancient, indifferent depths. The absolute annihilation of the Roman consular army at Lake Trasimene in the spring of 217, before the Common Era sent a wave of unparalleled panic through the heart of the Roman Republic. The mist that had aided the Carthaginian ambush eventually dissipated, revealing a landscape of profound, monochromatic stillness, where the north shore of the lake was covered in a thick, somber layer of the fallen, a silent testament to the efficacy of Punic geometry. This total erasure of 2 Roman legions, combined with the sudden death of Consul Flaminius, created a profound strategic paralysis within the Senate, which now found itself caught in a state of unparalleled stasis. In Rome, the news arrived not with the swiftness of victory, but through the slow indigo fog of a crushed republic. The single remaining consul, Gnaeus Servilius Geminius, was trapped on the eastern coast, unable to navigate the Punic-controlled heartland. Citizens gathered in the forum waiting for any signal, their hearts heavy with the realization that the myth of their invincibility was shattered. The Tiber itself seemed to reflect the pervasive indigo grief of the city. Academic consensus explains that the popular consul's death not only created a vacuum of leadership but also solidified the public's terror, making the name of Hannibal Barca a whisper of cold dread that resonated through every valley. And every Roman home, Hannibal, standing amidst the silence of his masterpiece, remained a figure of unmoving focus, his single eye surveying the cost, calculating the political ripples of this triumph across the Mediterranean world. His presence was a silent pillar, the only source of stability for an army now deep within enemy territory. He understood that while Trasimene was a tactical success, it had not secured the final strategic victory. The Punic commander utilized this period of Roman paralysis not to march directly on Rome, which he recognized his army lacked the siege equipment to invest, but to prioritize the erosion of the Republic's alliance network. He began a methodical southward progression, bypassing the capital and moving through the rich agricultural regions of Picenum and Apulia, seeking regions that could feed his troops and where the summer heat was more bearable. This choice to avoid the fortified fortress colonies was a calculated decision of psychological stasis, forcing Rome into a state of suspended agony, not knowing when or where the next blow would land. The Italian landscape, bathed in a rich indigo stillness, seemed to absorb the presence of the invading host, watching as it swayed through its valleys under the cover of the deep, velvet blue night. The soft, rhythmic clink of armor and the low murmurs of the diverse Punic host, now including new Gallic allies, were the only sounds in this desolate landscape. occasionally punctuated by the low resonant growl of Surus, the lone elephant survivor, who moved with a weary grace that mirrored the exhaustion of the troops. The scent of the air was a sharp mixture of wet iron, crushed oak, and the cold mineral tang of the mountain streams, every step a biological imperative pushing toward the promise of the fertile south, around the scattered, low-contrast Punic campfires, which cast soft orange glows that barely pierced the surrounding darkness. The soldiers cleaned their pitted armor, their faces reflecting a quiet, fatalistic determination as they prepared for the sudden, jarring violence that lay ahead. The stars above were softened by the humid haze of the Italian night, appearing as distant, blurred points of light that watched over the gathering storm with a calm, celestial indifference. This stasis of waiting was the calm before an even greater collision on the plain. As both Carthage and Rome held their breath in anticipation, the news of the total erasure at Lake Trasimene reached the gates of Rome like a cold, indigo wave of terror, prompting the Senate to take the extraordinary step of appointing Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus as dictator, a move that signaled a radical departure from the traditional Roman ethos of direct and aggressive confrontation. Fabius, who would later earn the epithets Cunctator or the Delayer, recognized that Hannibal's veteran army was nearly invincible in open terrain, and thus he initiated a strategy of persistent, rhythmic attrition that would come to define the middle years of the conflict. Under the cover of the deep, blue-tinted nights of the Italian summer, the Roman legions no longer sought to block Hannibal's path, but instead followed the invading host from the safety of the high, rugged ridges of the Apennines, maintaining a constant, watchful stasis that denied the Carthaginians the opportunity for another decisive victory. This shadow war was a test of patience and willpower, played out across a landscape of ancient, monochromatic forests and rocky defiles where the only sounds were the soft, metallic clinking of armor and the distant, haunting call of the mountain wind. Hannibal, moving his diverse force through the rich agricultural regions of Samnium and Campania, found himself frustrated by this new, elusive enemy that refused to engage while methodically stripping the countryside of the resources his army so desperately needed. The atmosphere of the Punic encampments during these months was one of profound, indigo tension as the soldiers sat around low, flickering fires, their eyes fixed on the dark, unmoving silhouettes of the Roman camps perched on the inaccessible heights above. The silence of the Italian night was heavy with the realization that the rules of the war had changed, becoming a slow, grinding struggle of logistics and endurance rather than a swift series of tactical masterpieces. Every movement of the Punic host was monitored by the Roman scouts, their presence appearing as faint, shifting shadows amidst the silver-lit peaks, creating a psychological pressure that wore on the nerves of even the most seasoned veterans. The air in the mountain passes was sharp and cool, carrying the scent of wild thyme, crushed stone, and the faint metallic tang of iron that was being kept in a state of constant, silent readiness. Hannibal, riding the lone elephant Surus, moved through the indigo shadows with the quiet focus of a predator whose prey had suddenly vanished into the mist. His mind already calculating how to provoke Fabius into the very mistake the dictator was so carefully avoiding. The logistical strain on the Carthaginian army began to mount. As the scorched earth tactics of the Romans forced the foragers to venture further into hostile territory, their movements appearing as tiny, wandering sparks in the vast, velvet dark of the valleys. The stars above were sharp and indifferent, watching over this monumental game of chess with a calm, celestial detachment, reflecting off the bronze shields and the tattered banners of an army that had crossed the Alps only to be caught in a web of delay. This period of strategic stasis was a crucial interval in the history of the Republic, a moment where the survival of Rome depended not on the bravery of its soldiers in battle, but on the discipline of its commander to stay in the shadows. The blue light of the moon continued to illuminate the jagged, vertical landscape, casting a serene and somber glow over the two armies that moved like synchronized ghosts through the heart of Italy. Each man's breath was a silent plume in the moonlight, a reminder of the life that persisted in the vertical desert of the Apennines, where the silence was the only witness to the gathering weight of a war that had no end in sight. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the army's march was muffled by the thick, summer humidity, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and vast, every step a biological imperative in a landscape that had become a prison of stone and mist. Hannibal's silhouette remained a dark, unmoving pillar against the vast, horizontal expanse of the camp, representing a willpower that refused to be broken by the indifference of the Roman command. This was the threshold of the next great trial, where the patience of the invader would be tested against the resilience of the defender. In a world of deep blue shadows, the strategic stasis imposed by the dictator Fabius eventually sparked a profound, indigo wave of political unrest within the Roman Senate, where the traditionalists and the populist factions clashed over the perceived cowardice of avoiding a direct engagement with the Punic invaders. By the summer of 216 before the Common Era, this internal tension led to the election of two new consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who were tasked with mobilizing the largest army in the history of the Republic to date, consisting of 8 legions and an equal number of allied units, a massive rhythmic sea of bronze and iron that moved south with a singular, destructive purpose. Hannibal, observing these developments from his winter quarters in Gerunium, understood that the moment of strategic patience was ending and that the Romans were finally prepared to offer the pitched battle he had sought since crossing the Alps. Under the cover of a deep velvet blue night, the Carthaginian commander executed a rapid and silent maneuver toward the south, seizing the vital grain stores at the citadel of Cannae on the banks of the Aphidus River. This move was a masterstroke of logistical provocation, as it cut off the primary supply route for the Roman forces and forced the consuls to march into the wide, open plains of Apulia, where the superior Punic cavalry could operate with maximum efficiency. The atmosphere of the Apulian landscape in the midsummer heat was one of heavy, expectant stillness, where the blue mists of the night rose from the parched earth and settled in the low-lying valleys, creating a world of muted colors and blurred horizons. Around the Carthaginian camp, the soldiers moved like ghosts through the shadows, their breath forming no vapor in the warm air but their armor reflecting the pale, silver light of a moon that seemed to hang low over the distant, jagged ridges of the Gargano. The scent of the air was a complex mixture of dry grass, crushed wild herbs, and the faint, metallic tang of the armor that was being polished for the coming slaughter. Every clink of a hammer and every rhythmic thud of a horse's hoof on the sun-baked soil was amplified by the profound silence of the plain, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. Surus, the lone elephant survivor, stood as a dark, unmoving monolith near the riverbank, its deep, resonant breathing providing a comforting, biological pulse to the encampment. Its massive form silhouetted against the indigo sky like a relic from a different world. Hannibal moved among his troops with a quiet, clinical focus, his single eye mapping the terrain with a surgeon's precision, identifying the subtle depressions and the prevailing winds that would later carry the dust of the plain into the eyes of the Roman legions. This was the threshold of the most significant tactical collision of the ancient world, where the quiet of the night was the only witness to the gathering strength of an army that had defied nature and was now preparing to trap the very heart of Rome. The blue shadows of the night stretched long across the fertile land, marking the slow, inevitable approach of the moment when the silence of the plains would finally be shattered by the sound of the trumpet, and the Aufidus would run red in the heat of a southern dawn. Within the tents, the soldiers lay in a deep, restorative sleep, their dreams no longer of mountain ice or marsh mud, but of the sharp, sudden clash of metal that lay only a few days ahead. While the stars above watched with a calm, celestial indifference, reflecting off the thousands of spears that stood like a silent forest in the dark, this period of waiting was a profound, indigo stasis, a moment in time where the weight of history was concentrated in the silence of the Apulian night, every breath a silent prayer, every shadow a potential fate. The night preceding the second day of August in the year 216 before the Common Era was characterized by a profound, indigo stillness that blanked the wide sun-parched plains of Apulia near the ancient citadel of Cannae, a landscape where the history of the Mediterranean was about to be distilled into a single, catastrophic afternoon. Hannibal Barca, the one-eyed master of the Punic host, stood upon a low wab rocky prominence overlooking the slow wab rhythmic flow of the Aufidus River, his gaze fixed not on the water, but on the immense, sprawling sea of Roman campfires that flickered on the southern horizon like a fallen, terrestrial constellation. The Roman army, consolidated under the alternating command of the consuls Varro and Palus, represented the greatest military mobilization in the history of the Republic, a massive rhythmic block of 80,000 men whose collective presence created a physical weight that seemed to press against the very earth itself. This was a force designed for total, crushing annihilation, yet within the Carthaginian encampment, there was no sense of impending doom, only a quiet, mechanical preparation that reflected the absolute, almost religious trust the veterans placed in their commander. Hannibal's tactical geometry for the coming dawn was a masterpiece of deceptive, fluid design. A convex crescent formation that would eventually draw the Roman heavy infantry into a lethal, indigo pocket of absolute containment. The air in the valley was heavy and warm, carrying the scent of dry grass, crushed wild herbs, the raw mineral tang of the river silt, and the faint, metallic aroma of iron being worked in the shadows. Every clink of a bronze buckle and every soft thud of a horse's hoof on the parched soil was amplified by the profound, expectant silence of the plain, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. Surus, the lone survivor of the Alpine Titans, stood as a dark, unmoving silhouette near the center of the camp, its deep, resonant breathing providing a comforting, biological pulse to the night. Its massive form a living relic of the journey from the snows to the sun. The Numidian cavalrymen, those elusive ghosts of the desert, moved silently among their wiry horses, checking harnesses and sharpening short swords with a rhythmic, hypnotic efficiency, while the Spanish and Gallic infantrymen, who would hold the critical and dangerous center of the line, sat in small circles, their eyes reflecting the dim orange glow of the dying embers. Hannibal understood the precise physics of the coming battle, knowing that the morning wind, the Volturnus, would rise and carry the fine, blinding dust of the plains directly into the eyes of the advancing Roman legions. A small but decisive environmental weapon in his grand strategic calculation. The stars above were sharp and indifferent, watching over the opposing armies with a calm, celestial detachment, their light reflecting off the vast forest of spears that stood in silent, vertical rows across the encampment. This stasis of waiting was the culmination of everything that had begun in the frozen passes of the Alps, a moment where the fate of empires was suspended in the deep, velvet indigo of the southern night. Every soldier felt the weight of the isolation, Yet the discipline of the host remained unbroken, their movements dictated by a rhythmic efficiency that had been honed through years of survival. The transition from the rest of the night to the violence of the day would be sudden and absolute, but for now, the focus was on the simple, rhythmic act of breathing in the humid air, the last hours of a world that would be fundamentally changed by the sun's rising. The mud along the riverbank, rich and dark, clung to the sandals of the sentries who paced the perimeter, their movements a steady, predictable rhythm that provided a comforting cadence to the night. A silent, fluid link to the geography they were destined to reshape through total war. The moon, a silver sliver in the sky, cast a serenity over the scene that masked the sheer desperation of the undertaking, making the tents appear as soft, shifting mountains of fabric in the blue mist. This was the eve of Cannae, the ultimate test of the Punic genius against the Roman iron. A night where the silence was the only witness to the gathering strength of an army that had defied the natural world and was now preparing to trap the very heart of Rome. The morning of the 2nd of August in the year 216 before the Common Era broke over the plains of Cannae, not with the clarity of a summer sun, but with a hazy, indigo-gray dawn that was heavily influenced by the rising Volturnus wind. This southeastern wind was a crucial element in Hannibal Barca's meticulous tactical design, as it began to lift the fine white dust from the parched Apulian soil and carry it directly into the faces of the massive Roman formations. The atmosphere was one of profound, expectant stasis, where the blue mists of the night had been replaced by a swirling, monochromatic veil of dust and humidity that muffled the sounds of 80,000 Roman soldiers deploying for battle. The Roman consuls, Varro and Paulus, had arranged their forces in an unprecedentedly deep and narrow formation, intending to use their overwhelming numerical superiority in heavy infantry to crush the Carthaginian center through sheer rhythmic weight. This massive block of humanity, a sea of bronze helmets and red-crested plumes, moved with a slow, mechanical precision that created a low, resonant vibration through the dry earth. Across the plain, Hannibal's army was positioned in a starkly different configuration, a long, convex crescent that bowed toward the enemy, consisting of the veteran Spanish and Gallic infantry in the center and the elite Libyo-Phoenician spearmen on the wings. The Spanish soldiers, with their white tunics bordered in purple and their short, lethal falcatas, stood in absolute predatory silence, while the Gallic warriors, naked to the waist and wielding long, iron swords, added a layer of fierce rhythmic energy to the line. The atmosphere in the Punic camp was one of clinical focus, a product of the absolute trust the diverse host placed in the one-eyed commander who now watched the horizon with a quiet, stoic intensity. Every clink of a harness and every soft thud of a horse's hoof on the parched soil was amplified by the profound stillness that preceded the clash, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. The scent of the air was a sharp mixture of dry grass, crushed wild herbs, oil, and the metallic tang of iron that was already being heated by the rising sun, though the light remained muted by the thick clouds of dust. Surus, the lone titan of the Alps, was positioned near the rear with the baggage train, its massive form a silent, unmoving anchor amidst the shifting sea of soldiers, its large eyes reflecting the hazy, silver light of the morning on the wings. The heavy Spanish and Gallic cavalry and the elusive Numidians were already beginning their silent, nocturnal mobilization to overlap the Roman flanks, their movements appearing as ghostly, shifting figures in the blue-tinged haze. Hannibal understood the precise physics of the coming collision, knowing that the center of his line was designed to yield, drawing the Roman weight into a lethal, indigo pocket of absolute containment. This was the threshold of the most devastating tactical enclosure in military history, where the quiet of the dawn was the prelude to a carnage that would echo through the centuries. The dust continued to swirl, creating a world of soft edges and hidden depths, where the silhouettes of the soldiers appeared as tattered banners in a landscape of blue and grey. Hannibal's silhouette remained a dark, unmoving pillar at the center of the crescent, his gaze fixed on the dense mass of the Roman center, his mind already calculating the timing of the collapse and the closing of the wings. The flags of Carthage, though worn from the journey through the marshes and the mountains, were held steady against the wind, their colors muted by the pervasive monochromatic light. The silence of the plains was about to be shattered by the sound of the trumpet. But for now, the atmosphere was one of deep meditative tension, as the history of the ancient world hung in the balance. Every breath taken by the soldiers was a reminder of the life that persisted in the horizontal desert of conflict. The mud along the riverbank, rich and dark, remained undisturbed by the coming storm, while the stars above finally vanished into the haze of the morning. Every soldier felt the weight of the isolation, yet the discipline of the host remained unbroken, their movements dictated by a rhythmic efficiency that had been honed through years of survival. The transition from the rest of the night to the violence of the day would be sudden and absolute. But for now, the focus was on the simple, rhythmic act of breathing in the dusty air. The last hours of a world that would be fundamentally changed by the sun's rising. The moon, a silver in the sky, had cast a serenity over the scene that now gave way to the hazy, indigo light of the battle. The Battle of Cannae began not with a sudden, jarring roar, but with a slow, rhythmic escalation of violence that resonated through the dusty, indigo haze of the Apulian plain. Hannibal Barca, positioned at the absolute center of his convex crescent, watched with a clinical, predatory stasis as the massive, mechanical block of the Roman infantry advanced, their thousands of heavy pylons raised like a forest of iron against the pale, silver light of the morning sun. The Roman strategy was a simple, brutal geometry, intending to use their overwhelming numerical weight to shatter the Carthaginian center through a continuous, rhythmic push. As the two great forces collided, the sound was a dull, heavy thud that was absorbed by the thick veil of volturnous dust that now blanked the entire battlefield, masking the expressions of the men who were about to die. Hannibal's veteran Spanish and Gallic infantry, who held the critical center of the line, fought with a controlled rhythmic retreat, strictly adhering to the commander's grand tactical design. They gave ground slowly, step by excruciating step, maintaining their cohesion while absorbing the full, crushing impetus of the Roman legionary assault. The Roman soldiers, seeing the Punic center seemingly buckle and retreat, believed they were witnessing the beginning of a total victory. Fueled by a righteous but blind fury, they pressed forward deeper into the evolving pocket, their massive central mass thickening as lateral units instinctively moved toward the perceived point of breakthrough. This forward surge created a chaotic, fluid geometry, where the rigid Roman formations began to dissolve into a tattered sea of red crests and bronze helmets, losing their operational space and effectively trapping themselves within the indigo shadows of the developing Punic pincer. On the far left and right flanks, the elite Libyo-Phoenician spearmen, who had been held in reserve, remained in static, ominous alignments, watching the Roman center pass them by, their heavy bronze shields reflecting the hazy light like dark, unmoving vertical slabs. They were the jaws of the trap, suspended in a state of clinical preparation, waiting for the precise mathematical moment when the Roman advance would reach its zenith. Hannibal, now moving with a slow, ghost-like grace through the swirling dust, monitored the depth of the pocket, his single eye calculating the vectors of containment, ensuring that the retreat of the center remained a disciplined maneuver and not a panicked rout. The atmosphere on the plain was heavy with the scent of wet leather, crushed wild herbs, sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron blades being kept busy in the shadows. Every clink of a sword on a shield and every thud of a body falling into the parched earth was amplified by the surrounding stillness, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. Surus, the lone titan of the Alps, remained a dark, unmoving monolith near the rear, a silent, vertical anchor amidst the horizontal desert of conflict, its large eyes reflecting the somber, monochromatic blue and grey tones of the morning. The stars above had long vanished into the haze, leaving the field in a state of soft, diffused light that masked the growing slaughter. This was the threshold of absolute annihilation, where the quiet geometry of the trap was about to be unleashed upon the unsuspecting heart of the Roman Republic, and the waters of the Aufidus would soon run red. Within the Roman ranks, the initial triumph was giving way to a crowded, fatalistic panic, as they found themselves packed so tightly together that they could no longer wield their weapons, while the Punic soldiers surrounding them moved with a fluid, mechanical efficiency that had been honed through years of survival. The Battle of Cannae shifted from the rhythmic collapse of the Punic Crescent to a state of absolute, mathematical containment, a pivotal moment that would be etched into the memory of the Republic as the defining slaughter of the century. Hannibal Barca, positioned now near the center rear of his inner crescent, watched with a clinical, predatory stasis as the massive Roman infantry center, the pocket from the previous dawn, found itself completely compressed, a chaotic, tightly packed crush of humanity that had lost all operational space, their thousands of pylons and shields effectively pinning them in a vertical stasis against their own ranks. The atmosphere on the plain was heavy with the scent of wet leather, sweat, crushed wild herbs, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron blades being kept busy in the shadows. Every clink of a sword on a bronze buckle and every thud of a body falling into the parched earth was amplified by the surrounding stillness, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. The turning point, according to ancient sources, came when the elite Libyo-Phoenician spearmen on the wings, who had been held in rigid, ominous alignment, finally executed the decisive inward turn, executing a precise, coordinated maneuver that transformed their deep columns into a massive, interlocking horizontal wall of bronze and iron, a lethal forest that closed the Punic pincer from the flanks. Simultaneously, the victorious Punic heavy and Numidian cavalry, those ghostly, shifting figures from the previous dawn, slammed with devastating force into the Roman rear, completing the encirclement and trapping the entire Roman consular army within a perfect indigo-gray geometry of annihilation. Hannibal, moving with a slow, ghost-like grace through the swirling dust, monitored the lethal alignment of containment, his single eye calculating the vectors, ensuring that the separation between the groups remained precise and that the collapse of the Roman formations was total. The stasis awaiting was the culmination of a plan forged in the aftermath of the marshes, a moment where the history of the ancient world held its breath. Inside the pocket, the exhaustion was profound. A heavy, leaden weight that slowed their sword arms and dulled their reflexes, while the Punic soldiers surrounding them moved with a fluid, mechanical efficiency that had been honed through years of survival. Consul Paulus, wounded earlier by a stone, refused to escape on a horse, his final moments spent amidst the silent, frozen embrace of his own legions. Hannibal observed the operational erasure of the Roman leadership, not as a triumph, but as a strategic necessity, a clinical detail in his grand design. By the time the sun had reached its zenith, the Roman forces were completely erased from the field, leaving only a somber, monochromatic layer of the fallen. Surus, the lone titan of the Alps, remained a dark, unmoving monolith near the rear, a silent, vertical anchor amidst the horizontal desert of conflict, its large eyes reflecting the somber, monochromatic blue and gray tones of the morning. The stars above had long vanished into the haze, leaving the field in a state of soft, diffused light that masked the growing slaughter. The silence of the lake returned, absorbing the echoes of the carnage into its ancient, indifferent depths. Hannibal, a figure of unparalleled focus, prepared the army for the next phase of the campaign, while the indigo shadows of the night returned to the Italian landscape, casting a serene and mournful glow over the path that led deeper into the heart of the Republic. The night that descended upon the battlefield of Cannae was wrapped in one of the deepest and most profound silences ever to settle over the plains of Apulia. The pale, silvery moonlight stretched across the thousands of motionless bodies like a blue shroud, as the absolute indifference of nature returned to the scarred landscape. The Carthaginian soldiers, moved by a rhythmic and heavy exhaustion, rather than a sense of triumph, drifted across the field like ghosts. Academic consensus notes that approximately 50,000 Roman soldiers and officers entered an eternal sleep upon the dusty earth that night, their bronze armor reflecting the cold light of the sky and creating a somber, metallic glimmer in every corner of the valley. Hannibal Barca stood alone at the edge of this silent geometry, measuring the limits of the absolute destruction he had achieved with his single eye. This was a rare moment where physical struggle was replaced by a meditative and mournful blue observation. The air was thick with the scent of damp iron, dried prairie grass, and the sharp, coppery aroma of blood soaking into the deep layers of the earth. The scent evoked both an ancient war and the searing reality of the present moment in the minds of the survivors. One of the most famous logistical details of this aftermath was the collection of golden rings from the fingers of the fallen Roman nobles and senators, which were poured into 3 large bushels. This pile of gold shone in front of Hannibal's tent as a visual testament to the collapse of the Roman aristocracy. Surus, the only elephant to survive the journey from the icy peaks of the Alps, stood like a dark and unmoving monolith by the river. His deep and rhythmic breaths echoed in the silence of the camp as a biological pulse, providing a strange sense of security to the weary men. Although his cavalry commander Maharbal argued that the army should march on the gates of Rome without delay, Hannibal chose to remain in a state of strategic calm. He understood the logistical impossibility of capturing a city as massive as Rome at this stage, without siege equipment or full local support. This decision created a deep and indigo pause in the history of the war. The immense momentum of the victory struck the wall of logistical reality and strategic caution. The stars above watched over this silent field with cold and brilliant light, reflecting the eternal indifference of the universe to human ambition. The silence was so absolute and dense that the soldiers could hear the slow and rhythmic beating of their own hearts, like the only biological drums standing against the night. Every sword and every shield was filled with the scratches and dents of the journey's hardships. The flags of Carthage, which once fluttered in vibrant colors, hung still and heavy in the windless air. The camp was like a momentary pause in the relentless forward motion of history. When the moon reached its highest point, the shadows of the hills deepened and created sharp geometric shapes across the plain. This scene contained both a peaceful beauty and an absolute alienation from human life. The silence on the plain was not just an absence of noise, but the physical presence weighing upon the soul. This presence whispered to every soldier's heart that the impossible had been achieved, but the end was still very far away. In the coldest hour of the night, the blue light of the moon turned into a rich velvet color and spread over the thousands of tired men dreaming of home. Every breath turned into a white pillar of vapor in the moonlight, reminding everyone that life persisted in the middle of this vertical and horizontal desert. The flow of history seemed frozen on this dusty plain that night. The great silence that followed the annihilation at Cannae settled over the southern plains of Italy like a heavy, indigo shroud, marking the conclusion of one monumental chapter and the uncertain beginning of another in the long, rhythmic struggle for control of the Mediterranean world. As the moon reached its absolute zenith over the dark, slow-moving waters of the Aufidus River, the Carthaginian army existed in a state of profound meditative stasis, their bodies finally yielding to the immense weight of a journey that had spanned thousands of miles and redefined the limits of human endurance. Hannibal Barca stood at the edge of the encampment, his silhouette a dark, unmoving vertical against the vast, horizontal expanse of the Apulian night, his single eye surveying the southern horizon where the heart of the Republic lay in a state of paralyzed terror. The air was thick with the scent of parched earth, cooling iron, and the faint, metallic tang of blood that had been absorbed by the soil, a sensory landscape that was both ancient and immediate. Around the low-burning fires, which cast soft, orange glows that barely pierced the surrounding darkness, the veterans of the Alps and the marshes moved like ghosts, cleaning their pitted armor and sharpening their blades with a silent, mechanical efficiency that had become a biological instinct. The Iberian infantrymen, their white tunics now stained with the indigo dust of the plains, sat in small circles, their gaze fixed on the flickering embers as they dreamed of the sunlit hills of their distant home, while the Numidian cavalrymen whispered to their small, wiry horses in the melodic languages of the desert, their voices a low hum that blended with the rustle of the dry grass. Surus, the lone survivor of the great elephant herd, stood near the commander's tent like a dark, unmoving monolith, its deep, resonant breathing providing a steady, rhythmic pulse to the night, its massive form a living testament to the survival of a willpower that had conquered the stone, the ice, and the mud. This was a moment of perfect, blue-tinged suspension, where the memory of the frozen passes and the reality of the sun-drenched victory were merged into a single, atmospheric whole. The stars above were brilliant and cold, appearing as sharp points of light that watched over the sleeping host with a calm, celestial detachment, their light reflecting off the thousands of spears that stood in silent, vertical rows like a forest of iron. Every clink of a harness and every thud of a hoof on the soft soil was amplified by the profound stillness of the plain, creating a soundscape that was both intimate and monumental. The strategic genius of Hannibal had reached its peak, yet the silence of the Roman walls in the distance served as a reminder of the trials yet to come, a slow, grinding war of attrition that would last another 17 years. The atmosphere of the camp was one of quiet, fatalistic determination, a collective recognition that the path they had forged through the clouds had led them to the very threshold of history. The blue shadows of the night stretched long across the fertile land, marking the slow, inevitable approach of a new dawn that would bring no finality. Each man's breath was a silent plume of white vapor in the moonlight, a reminder of the life that persisted in the horizontal desert of conflict, a rhythmic pulse that defied the shadows,